Again, welcome to the Kennedy Center lecture on nuclear testing and national security. For other opportunities to hear from Department of State representatives or members of the Foreign Service, please follow the BYU Foreign Service Student Organization on Facebook. We'll post many opportunities as well as information about joining Department of State and preparing for the test. It is my pleasure to introduce Undersecretary Rose Gottemoeller. She is the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. In this role, she serves as a senior advisor to the President and the Secretary of State on matters of arms control and nonproliferation. She was the chief U.S. negotiator of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the Russian Federation and was responsible for its ratification process in the U.S. Senate. Please join me in welcoming Undersecretary Gottemoeller.
Well, thank you all. It's good to be back at BYU today. It's a pretty small group today, so I think I'll just make a few remarks from here at the podium, and then I'll resume my seat, and maybe we can have more or less an informal discussion on these matters. I'll be very interested in your questions and what you think is going to be, an important set of issues in this area of trying to get the ratification done of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. People ask me, they say, are you crazy? Do you think you can get anything else ratified by the U.S. Senate at this point? And it is my very experience working on ratification of the New START Treaty that makes me believe that we have a shot. The reason is that there was actually a responsible attitude among our U.S. senators to the New START Treaty. This was the treaty that has contributed to further reducing our strategic nuclear arsenal. Right now, we're working on the reductions right now, but we have about 2,200 deployed strategic nuclear warheads, and by the time the New START Treaty is fully implemented, we will be down to 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads. So this was a treaty that was hard fought in the Senate because a lot of senators, if you say the word nuclear, they say, allergic reaction, we don't want to have to think about that or talk about that. And as a matter of fact, it was the most important argument, I think, was the argument that we needed to have our eyes on the Russian nuclear arsenal and have a predictable and stable relationship with them. And I have to tell you that it's clear to me that it's paid off right now because we're in a period of grave crisis with the Russian Federation over their incursion into Ukraine. Now we're concerned about what's going on in Syria and what they're up to in Syria. And having a stable and predictable relationship concerning our nuclear forces is a very solid underpinning for what is otherwise a frankly troubled and difficult bilateral relationship, with President Putin being very difficult and unpredictable to deal with. Thank heavens that we have stability and predictability with regard to our nuclear forces. So oddly, despite the fact we are butting heads over a number of things bilaterally, New START is being smoothly implemented, and the Russians are ready to continue to do so. It's a very business-like approach. And so I think those senators on both sides of the aisle who voted for the New START Treaty should feel good about it right now. It really is contributing to U.S. national security. And those senators on both sides of the aisle who dug down deep during the ratification process came to that conclusion on their own, that the treaty is in U.S. national security interest and will serve those interests well no matter what happens with Moscow. Now, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is a little more complicated because it is a multilateral agreement. 183 countries around the world have signed the treaty. So it's a bigger deal, but the fact that it is a bigger deal is very important because it will prevent the modernization of nuclear arsenals around the world. It will also hinder the development of new nuclear arsenals, hinder new states from getting into the acquisition of nuclear weapons. I think about it as it doesn't actually, totally stop deployment. If a country is bound and determined, they can deploy without testing, but they're always going to have the uncertainty. They won't know for sure that the system will work or not, the warhead will work or not, and that is why we say comprehensive test ban is important for placing speed bumps in the way of nuclear programs. For nuclear powers who already exist, it really prevents them from modernizing. They can't know that their more advanced designs are going to work, and so it places speed bumps in the way of modernization. We're very concerned about that in Asia today. We've got arms race going on among Asian countries, India, Pakistan, China. So preventing a nuclear arms race in Asia is an important national security goal for us that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty can serve. For states that we're concerned could acquire nuclear weapons, they could develop a simple design like the design that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but will they ever know if it will work? So it injects uncertainty into their calculus. And most importantly, for the international community as a whole, the in-force Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty puts in place an international verification regime that will ensure that essentially the cheating that might go on is caught. And that, I think, is a very, very important aspect of this as well, that the legally binding treaty will, really permit the catching of cheaters, will help to prevent illicit nuclear testing, because countries will know not only is there an international monitoring system all over the world with a series of seismic sensors, radiological sensors, infrasound sensors, hydroacoustic sensors. Internationally, this system has been developed and deployed over the last 20 years and is now in place. So big international monitoring system available, but also on-site inspection will be available. So if a country is suspected of conducting an illicit nuclear test, then teams will go in and conduct an on-site inspection. So having an international monitoring system and other aspects of the verification regime in place makes it important to have a legally binding test ban. You don't get that verification regime unless you have a legally binding test ban in force. Today we have a moratorium. President George H.W. Bush put in place a moratorium in 1992, and that moratorium has been joined by countries around the world. The United States itself has not conducted a nuclear test since 1992. Other countries have joined, as I said, and the country that has tested in this century is North Korea. That is the only country that has tested in this century. So people say, well, why don't we just stick with the moratorium? Why do we need to go through all the hoops to ratify this treaty on Capitol Hill, to really get that heavy rock pushed uphill? And I say it is precisely because we want to have mechanisms in place to go after the most difficult cases like North Korea, to be able to have in place the mechanisms of an international monitoring system and on-site inspection to really go after those that we are most concerned about in the world. And certainly North Korea is the most difficult individual case, I would say. I mentioned, as I said earlier, our concerns about the dynamics and the arms racing behavior among India, Pakistan, and China. So it is quite notable. You mentioned the interest at BYU in getting more into India, and frankly, this is a small niche of policy, nuclear weapons policy, but it is among the most dangerous aspects of the relationship between India and Pakistan, the fact that India, with its conventional superiority, has built up over time. Pakistan, and this was exactly what happened during the Cold War, Pakistan putting in place essentially a nuclear capability, even down to the level of battlefield nuclear weapons, which they say, if India comes across the border, we will face them with battlefield nuclear weapons. So this kind of hair-trigger nuclear response is what could lead rapidly to nuclear escalation. And with India facing off against Pakistan, and Pakistan having a close partner and ally in China, you can see that the dynamics could be very, very dangerous for the potential for nuclear war in Asia. People ask me, what worries you the most? What keeps you awake at night? And there are really two things. One is this nuclear dynamic in Asia between, India and Pakistan, with China standing in the neighborhood as well, and the possibility of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists. Again, that unstable situation in South Asia is one that constantly is of concern. Not only nuclear weapons, of course, but highly enriched uranium and plutonium fissile material that could be used by nuclear states to build a nuclear bomb, but if it falls into the hands of terrorists, could also be used to build a primitive nuclear device, a so-called improvised nuclear device. So the reason I wanted to come back here to BYU and speak again today, last year when I was here we talked about the kind of nuclear arms control environment more generally, but I wanted to concentrate on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty today because it is a treaty that is timely. It is a treaty that will help us with some of the major national security problems that we have today in the nuclear realm, will help us, I think, to advance nonproliferation goals like ensuring that nuclear weapons and fissile material don't fall into the hands of terrorists. It really enhances our efforts and our ability to lead on this issue internationally. So it's high time that the United States does the heavy lifting to get this treaty across the finish line in the U.S. Senate. In 1999, we attempted to ratify the treaty, and the Senate failed to give its advice and consent. So following that experience, we went out and asked the senators, why? Why wouldn't you vote for this important treaty? We came close. There were 51 votes in favor of the treaty, but it wasn't enough. You need 2/3 to ratify. So the answer that came back, I think, was very important to understand. First, the senators said, we're not sure. You say you're going to build an international monitoring system, but we don't see it yet. We don't know if it's going to work. Are you really going to get this international verification regime in place? As I mentioned now, 20 years from that point, the IMS system is up and is fully operating. In fact, it's already contributing to international science on seismic matters and also doing some very practical things like tsunami warning. I'm looking at that beautiful photo of the wave back there that says peace, but it also reminds me a bit of tsunamis. Anyway, following the big tsunami back almost 10 years ago now, the international monitoring system began to pump information that was coming from the seismic sensors into the International Tsunami Warning Network, and it's been a very, very important aspect of that program. Also, radiation detection. When the Fukushima power plant accident happened a couple of years ago, it was within a week that the radioactive cloud from that accident, moved around the Earth, and it was tracked every step of the way by the radiation detection that is part of the international monitoring system. So the IMS is already proving its worth, and I think we have a good answer for the senators today who say, you're never going to get this international verification system up and running. It is up and running, and it is already proving to be very valuable. The second question the senators had at that time was, you say you're going to maintain our nuclear weapons stockpile without testing. How can we be sure of that? 1992, President Bush put in place a moratorium. It's only 7 years later. How do we know we don't need to return to test in order to maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal? Well, at that time, the Department of Energy was putting in place the so-called science-based stockpile stewardship program, which is a series of scientific methods, technologies. Supercomputing is turned to this purpose. Other types of experiments that can be conducted without resulting in explosive nuclear testing. Back in 1999, again, the national laboratories, our national nuclear laboratories, the directors said, we don't know if it's going to work yet either. And that was an important factor for many senators in saying no to the treaty in 1999. Today, I was just at an event last week that was sponsored by Secretary Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, who was so important to the negotiation of the technical aspects of the Iran nuclear deal. Secretary Moniz invited all the lab directors to come together to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Stockpile Stewardship Program, and the lab directors were willing and ready to say publicly that we can maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear stockpile now better through science-based stockpile stewardship than we could in the era of explosive nuclear testing. So again, the two questions that the senators asked back in 1999, to my mind, have been fully answered at this point. And so we have a good defense of the treaty. But it's going to take time. It's going to take effort. I've been speaking at universities around the country, particularly in states that either were the sites of nuclear tests. I was in Alaska last week, where they conducted three nuclear tests, rather, the so-called peaceful nuclear uses tests, believe it or not. They were using nuclear tests to see if they could dig out harbors or dig canals using nuclear explosions. They blew the heck out of Anichka Island up there, and it has, created there, to this day, radioactive contamination and problems for the local populations in that area. I also was in Colorado last week, where they conducted two nuclear tests at the end of the 60s, early 1970s, with the goal of seeing whether they could be used for gas fracking. Can you imagine using a nuclear blast for gas fracking? It just makes you scratch your head. But it was tried, and thank heavens, peaceful nuclear explosions were banned by the so-called PNET Treaty, the Peaceful Nuclear Explosions Treaty, which was brought into force in 1990. So we do not talk about using nuclear weapons for construction projects anymore, I'm happy to say. In addition to which, we put in place a so-called threshold test ban treaty in 1990. It joined the limited test ban treaty that President Kennedy negotiated in 1963 after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there was a lot of public support for the limited test ban treaty, which banned tests in the atmosphere, because at that time the atmospheric testing was producing a lot of problem. Well, you in Utah know well about the contamination problems, but it was causing elements like strontium-90 to get into the food chain and really affecting things like baby milk. I remember my own mother in 1958, 59 saying she didn't want us drinking milk because it would potentially cause problems because of the strontium-90 contamination. So there was a lot of public support for the limited test ban treaty, and that was then joined by the impetus from the crisis that happened over Soviet nuclear deployments in Cuba to push rapidly forward the limited test ban treaty, which banned tests in the atmosphere in 1963. So, long story short, we've had a series of these treaties over time that have been entered into force, but the comprehensive test ban treaty will ban nuclear explosions forever. So again, I think it's very much manifestly in the U.S. national security interest. It is very important, I think, to ensure that we do not see a continued proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world, and also that we do not see a continued modernization of nuclear weapons programs around the world. So I wanted to urge you here in Utah to think about it. Again, I will be visiting all the states where nuclear blasts occurred. Interestingly, Mississippi was another place where we tested nuclear weapons. New Mexico, Nevada, clearly the site of the nuclear test site, which is now closed to nuclear testing but devoted to scientific research. So, but want to visit all these places to really talk to audiences, make the point about the importance of the test ban, and hope that you will join us in a national conversation on the importance of this treaty and the importance of moving it toward the ratification process. We need to raise awareness about the treaty, which has been out of the public eye now for many, many years. and really, get the public engaged and involved so that they can then talk to their representatives on Capitol Hill and say, it's time to take a serious look at this treaty. Last thing I'll say is we're not rushing into anything. We do not want to rush forward and try to force a vote on this treaty before there's been time for this public conversation, for the public to be fully supportive, and for the senators on Capitol Hill to have a chance to examine the national security benefits of the treaty and get all their questions answered. I'm sure they will have many. Anyway, as I said before, I'm going to sit down just right here in front for a more kind of informal discussion since we've got a pretty small group. Although I should say, this is being filmed, so.
I can give you this lav mic if you'd like to record for audio, or yeah, we can do that.
Will that not cause any problems?
No, not at all.
All right. Well, I'm going to sit down then, so make it a little bit more informal. Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Bradley Anderson. I study international relations and Japanese. My question is just in reaction to, you've mentioned multiple times that the Russian Federation is not currently particularly cooperative with all of the security measures. My question is, to what extent, what's their intent behind not being cooperative? I would imagine certain, maybe questions of sovereignty, but at the same time, are they trying to reserve, the rights to certain nuclear activity that can't be monitored for certain reasons?
Well, it is a very sensitive area, and everybody around the room can recognize that nuclear weapons are among the most sensitive objects that a country can produce or will produce. So clearly they're not something for the street in any way, shape, or form. The good cooperation that we developed in the 1990s, as I said, then blossomed into what is called the Global Partnership, which is a global partnership to counter nuclear terrorism, to work together on physical protection in other countries, particularly of radiological devices, because not a whole lot of countries have fissile material, which is a good thing. So we always were able to work well with the Russians up until this latter period when they withdrew. And partially, I'll be frank with you, I think it was to punish us for the tough steps that we took. We really cracked down, exerting a number of wide-ranging economic sanctions against them for their incursion in Ukraine. And I support that. It's important that, in the way that they have violated the territorial integrity and sovereignty of one of their neighbors, the international community cannot be silent on that matter. So we needed to send a clear message of concern about this, and economic sanctions was a way to do so. But frankly, I think one of their reasons for the reaction now on the nuclear security front is they're saying, nuts to you. You think this is important, but you're causing us all these other economic problems. We're not going to cooperate in this area anymore. I have tended to emphasize when I talk to my Russian counterparts that no matter what our differences are bilaterally, our concerns about Russian behavior, their concerns about ours, that nevertheless weapons of mass destruction threats are of such importance to the international community overall that we should be able to set aside our differences and work on these weapons of mass destruction problems in any event. But thus far, my arguments have fallen on deaf ears. Another factor I will say is the resurgence of the security services. Already by 1997, they had put in place a new security law, making it much more difficult to cooperate on matters involving sensitive facilities in Russia. And they've continued over the years to kind of tighten up that series of security laws. And so it becomes much more difficult for different ministries and organizations to cooperate with us on these matters. So that is definitely also a factor. Thanks. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah.
My name is Benjamin Smith. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic student. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on, assuming that the Senate was able to ratify this treaty, how far do you think that would go in terms of giving us more leverage or influence to pressure other states that either haven't signed or haven't ratified the treaty, like Iran or India or Pakistan? Would that go a long way? Do you think it's holding us back that we haven't ratified it in that sense?
Yes, and thank you for that good question. It allows me to talk a little bit more about the details of what has to happen for the treaty to actually enter into force. Part of the treaty proper is so-called Annex 2, which lists the states that actually must ratify the treaty in order for it to enter into force. And they are the states that have nuclear weapons, and they are the nuclear weapon states under the nonproliferation treaty, so that's UK, France, China, Russia, and the United States. Those 5 states are the nuclear weapon states under the nonproliferation treaty. But it also includes other states that have nuclear capabilities. India and Pakistan, you mentioned. North Korea is on that list. So these are really tough customers. So it's a good question. People sometimes ask me, well, even if we do ratify, it's not going to make North Korea ratify the treaty anytime soon. But frankly, I think, my view is, and this is funny, China and the United States are the only 2 nuclear weapon states under the nonproliferation treaty who have not yet ratified the treaty. Russia has, UK, France has. And so constantly we get bombarded with US must go next, US must go next. And I always say to the Chinese, well, why wait? You don't need to wait for us. Please, be our guest, go ahead. And guess what they answer? They say, you first. Exactly, exactly. But I keep needling them, including publicly, as I do today, to say, you don't need to wait for us, you can go first. Because they have assured me that when we do go with our ratification, they'll be soon to follow. So I think having the 2 remaining nuclear weapon states under the nonproliferation treaty ratify it will create a big burst of momentum for the other states that need to ratify. And I think that it will really up the level of pressure in very, very significant ways. And frankly, I would like to be in the policy situation of North Korea being the only outlier, the only state not yet to have ratified. As I said at the outset, they are the only country in this century that has explosively tested nuclear weapons. So frankly, I'd like that as a policy problem, to have the weight of world opinion and the weight of the world directed on getting them to ratify the treaty. But thank you for that question, because it allowed me to talk about the complexities that are out there. Our ratification will not mean that the treaty enters into force, but I think it will really give a huge impetus to entry into force and be very important for moving the whole process forward. Yes, please.
What do you
Why don't
consider
you
to be?
wait for the microphone?
Again, I'm Amber Kent. I studied international relations. What do you consider to be a major roadblock in the way of the U.S. ratifying this treaty?
The biggest roadblock is the one that I referred to in my talk, and that is the treaty has been out of the public eye for 17 years now, since 1999. When we were pushing the ratification fight on Capitol Hill in 1999, at that time there was some survey information out there. 85% of the American public knew about the treaty and supported the ratification of the treaty. Today, if you talk, to the man on the street or the woman on the street and say, do you know about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty? The answer from probably over 85% of the American public is going to be no. I don't know what this treaty is or why it's important to U.S. national security. So for that reason, I think our biggest enemy is, or our biggest, not enemy, but our biggest problem is getting that public attention again. In the first instance, getting the public interest in the treaty as a national security matter, and then having a feedback loop with Capitol Hill and the senators starting to hear from people that they think it's important to move forward on it. That was the experience we had with the New START treaty, that we got a lot of support from the public, We got a lot of support from the faith-based communities. I know a couple of the senators changed their votes because their pastor said that it's a good and serious treaty. They need to look at it hard. So I know that public attention and faith-based organizations, as well as non-governmental organizations, the expert community, can make a big difference to really upping the profile and getting a treaty across the finish line. Now the other problem, and again, I referred to it at the outset, people think I'm crazy for thinking any treaty can be ratified at all. Part of the problem is our Senate has not been particularly enthusiastic and active in recent years ratifying treaties. That's one of the reasons why the Iran deal that just was negotiated was done as an executive agreement. Of course, the Congress demanded a say in the Iran deal, and that legislation was passed. In the end, the administration worked very closely with the House of Representatives and the Senate to talk about the value of the Iran deal, to work with them to convey its importance as a national security benefit to the United States and our partners and allies. And it worked, but the thing is, foreign policy is an important priority for this country, and we need to get foreign policy done. And so we need to have the opportunity to work with the Senate on treaties and agreements. So I do think it will be important going forward to work with the Senate, to work with Capitol Hill, to convey the importance of paying attention to the necessity of treaty ratification, number one, but also on Capitol Hill, there's a huge requirement for education and information flow about this treaty, because most of the senators who were there in 1999 and voted either for or against the treaty are now gone. They're retired, they've left public office, they're not there anymore. So again, we have to build up the knowledge base on Capitol Hill as well.
Sensitive of people's time, maybe we could take one more question, or if not, why don't we join me, please, and we'll thank the Undersecretary for a really insightful discussion and comments, and thanks for your interest.
Thank you very much.